Welcome everyone. Just letting a few more people in and then we'll begin. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. This class is the second session of What Make Halakhic Loopholes Religious with Dr. Elana Stein Hain. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Dr. Hain.
Let's do it. Amazing. I want to remind some people what we did last week. If you were there, great. If you weren't, check out the recording on Drisha's website. What we did last week is we started with the basics. The basics are that Chazal, the rabbis, 3rd to 7th century, looked at the concept of loopholes as a big question mark. Not a question mark that comes after the question, are loopholes good or bad? But actually, the question that they asked were, when are loopholes useful, appropriate, even recommended? And when are loopholes problematic, inappropriate? And then also the question of when do reasonable people disagree? All right, that's what we put out last week. We basically made two big claims. One is that instead of Chazal saying whatever we can formally justify, we will, what we suggested is actually Chazal are working with integrity of the purpose of using the loophole and integrity of the process of using a loophole. Integrity of the purpose of using a loophole is essentially those values that halakha as a whole cares about, like ensuring that people don't go bankrupt from keeping mitzvot, keeping people from having to transgress an avera not of their own doing, for example. Those values are legitimate goals. And we talked about how Rabbi Eliezer, at least according to the Talmud Yerushalmi, might have a narrower definition of what goals constitute, or a narrower list of what constitutes halachic goals, like maybe not transgressing an avera. And Rabbi Yeshua might have a more expansive understanding of what are considered halachic values that are legitimate goals. But either way, both of those fit under the rubric of integrity of goals. And then we had integrity of process. And the example of integrity of process that we saw last week was the question of, yes, of course you have good goals, you have the right goals for this, but what type of halachot are permitted to be circumvented and what are not? So an example that was offered within the Talmud Yerushalmi was perhaps explicit violations in the Torah, such as placing an item in an oven on Yom Tov, not in order to cook it to be eaten or bake it to be eaten on Yom Tov, that would be an explicit violation of Torah and that couldn't be circumvented. Whereas something that is in Isser Shavut, something that we might call derabanan, rabbinic, but at least in the Yerushalmi, at least we know that it means it's not explicit in the Torah, like the status of muktzah of animals is something that you could circumvent. Now that's really interesting. And what we're going to see today is that the Bavli has what to say about both of those, integrity of goals and integrity of process. But that was one major claim that we made last week, integrity of goals and integrity of process, and that sometimes different Amoraim are going to focus on a different type of integrity. Carolyn, I'm calling you in 1 second. The second thing that we basically suggested is to think about loopholes not only as their own category, but to think about the whole way that Chazal think about halakha. The idea that the way you do something and not just the end result actually matters. So we think about that in Hilchot Shabbat, for example, where if you do something in one manner, it may be a biblical violation. But if you did it with a shinoi, if you did it with some sort of change in the process, it would end up being a rabbinic violation only, right? So that's actually a way of saying that the form of halakha and the content of halakha are actually partners. This is very, very different from a Greco-Roman way of looking at law, from a Christian way of looking at law, and from a Western way of looking at law, because we're often taught to think of the form or the way you do something. This, I think, the idea that the form of law, as opposed to, I don't know, the function or the substance, that you would prefer one over the other, it's a very Greco-Roman, then Christian than Western idea. And so I think it takes a whole lot of reimagining to think about legal loopholes. It's not an exception to this system of Chazalic thinking. It is actually a perfect example of the different way that they think. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I don't remember if I gave this example, we actually talked about how in the 19th century, there's a resurgence of the idea. It's called historical jurisprudence. In Germany, there's a resurgence of the idea that the function of law is not everything, but the form that law has taken on actually has significance in that it represents the folk spirit of the people, the Volksgeist of the people, which is a kind of reincarnation of this way of thinking about law. So I just want to think about how live those things are. Carolyn, it seemed like you had a question about last week for a clarification. I'm sure it will be helpful to
Yes,
everyone.
I hope so. For clarification purposes, when we say that we assume that Chazal are working with integrity of purpose of loophole and integrity of process, do you mean integrity of process of halacha or integrity of process of making the loophole? And now that I'm saying that, I realize that's probably one and the same thing.
Well, I think you could say integrity of process of making a loophole might say who got to decide that it's legitimate, right? So I don't think they're talking about that, because I think their assumptions are that they're going to be the ones who are deciding what's legitimate. So here it really is, does it hold halakha together, or is it something that seems like it undermines the halakha? Now, I have to tell you, the example that we saw in the Yerushalmi of an explicit law not being circumventable is completely upended by the fact that the two examples of proactive ha'arama, the rabbinic term for loopholing, in the Mishnah are biblical explicit laws needing to give an extra 25% if you are redeeming your own secondary tithe produce, because you're not going to schlep it all the way to Yerushalayim, but instead you're going to redeem it with money and spend that money in Yerushalayim. And the Kiddusha, the sanctity of a firstborn kosher animal. Those are both biblical injunctions, and yet the Mishnah gives as examples, Ketzad Marimin, how are we able to loophole? So there's clearly something going on with the conversation within Chazal, trying to figure out when yes, when no. And I think what we want to do in the Bavli today, and next week, by the way, we're going to talk about Mechirat Chametz specifically, because I think it is important, especially because we're in that season. I think it's important to see how the whole conversation around Mechirat Chametz, selling your Chametz, actually is nurtured by this whole conversation that we have about loopholes in general within Chazal, even though they don't call it Ha'arama. Generally speaking, Chazal do not use the term Ha'arama when they are referring to something that is a takana, a wide-scale pervasive change. They don't use it in terms of prosbul, the ability to collect debts after the 7th year. They don't use it in terms of eruv, the ability to carry in a public thoroughfare or a pseudo-public thoroughfare on Shabbat. And they don't use it about Mechirat Chametz. They don't use it about Mechirat Chametz, not because Mechirat Chametz was such a pervasive loophole at that time. It really was not, as we'll see next week. But I think they don't use it about Mechirat Chametz for the same reason they don't use it about a lot of examples that we would consider loopholing within the Mishnah and the Tosefta. And that reason is, I couldn't tell you. And this is not after spending a very long time trying to figure it out, which is why some people, when they learned that I was working on my dissertation and following the term ha'arama, which, as you remember from last week, is the rabbinic term for loopholes, and it has, the serpentine, arum mikol chayat hasadeh, more cunning in a bad way than all of the animals. And it also has the Solomonic book of Mishlei, Proverbs, ani chochma shachanti or ma. If you want wisdom, you have to get involved with some prudence, with some common sense. They said to me, why are you following that? Why are you following that term? Chazal are for sure not going to be completely consistent. And I said, well, what's my alternative? Right. So what I'm hoping is that I did this work on Harama, and I'm hoping that the next scholar will say, hey, you missed this, and you missed this, and you missed this, and we want to build on this. And let's keep going, right? Let's start a conversation and let's keep going. So let's talk about what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the Bavli, Babylonian Talmud, really, really interesting. in the way that it deals with Ha'arama, because I would say it is incredibly integrity of process oriented, incredibly so. There are also ways that it tweaks the ideas of integrity of goals, and we're going to see that. But I want you to see some of the treatments in the Bavli of the same examples that we saw in the Yerushalmi from last week. I want you to see how the Bavli differs and subtly makes shifts. And a little bit of an overarching thesis here is that the Bavli, it really evinces serious suspicion of Ha'arama that is going to use performative intention. So last week, when we talked about a person making matzah on first day of Pesach, do not do this at home or anywhere else, but a person making matzah on Pesach and realizing that they had to separate challah dough, but the challah dough was tummy and they'd have to put it in the oven and burn it. And Rabbi Eliezer says, no problem, put it in the oven and just don't say that it's challah until it's already in the oven with all the other pieces. And what do? I want to eat this piece, I want to eat this piece, I want to eat this piece. Performing an intention to eat, the Bavli won't have it. Absolutely not. I have my two animals that fall into a pit, a mother-child pair. I want to take them both out, but I can't. They're muktzah, and I can't take them out to slaughter them because they can't both be slaughtered on the same day. So I can only take out one. Rabbi Yeshua says, untrue. I'm taking out one in order to slaughter it. Performed intention. I mean, who are you performing it? Are you performing it out loud? Are you performing it in your mind? Like what's going on here? And Rabbi Yeshua says, no problem. You take it out in order to slaughter it and then decide, not so interested, looks kind of skimpy. And then you take out the other one in order to slaughter it. A little gaunt, I'm not interested. And then you don't shecht either of them, right? Performed intention, Bavli's not into it. So we're going to see that. And that to me is different than, Elana, I'm not allowed to sell you something. So instead, what I do is I sell it to Neil. Neil gives me money. Neil sells it to you, and you give money to Neil. That to me is not performed intention. That's changing the facts on the ground. The Bavli seems pretty okay with that, but it's not okay with performed intention. Okay. And I want to talk about why, and really the fact that it seems like the Bavli, and this is a whole conversation in and of itself, and you can read this in Dr. Ayelet Lipson's excellent book about the subjective self in Chazal. You can read this in a conversation, arguments between different academics about the degree to which the earliest rabbinic conversations, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Yerushalmi, how much were they thinking about a person as what's inside of you is so subjective and it's something that only you know? And how much were they thinking about a person's intention as something that they perform? Meaning they're not thinking so deeply subjectively. And the suggestion is that as you get to the Bavli, subjectivity matters a lot more. So if in my heart, Ellen, if in her heart is saying, I don't really want to eat this thing, and everybody can tell, then it doesn't matter if she makes it look like she does, right? It's what's in there also matters, right? It's not just the way she's performing it, okay? So let's see. So that's one declaration. A second declaration is just the way that the Bavli uses Ha'arama. Has hardly any new examples of Ha'arama that don't show up in the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and the Yerushalmi. It's basically only quoting, with the exception of like two, like really. And it also starts to use the term le'iarume, the Aramaicized version of Ha'arama, to mean to lie. So you're sort of saying to yourself, like, on the one hand, they don't have to use the term Ha'arama anymore because it's something that's part and parcel of the way they do things. On the other hand, they're using li'yarume to mean to lie. And I would say, staying on that other hand, they're not crazy about the idea of subjectively faked intention, right? They're not crazy about the idea of performing intention, because that's actually supposed to be what's really going on inside. Okay, so that's our headline. Now let's look at some examples. And don't worry, I'll stop like halfway through the examples. I want you to just see some of the examples and see what's going on here. Okay, my sources are on the side. You can follow along, but I also want to do a shared screen so that we can all be together here. Now this is, I'm not sure what just happened. This is the Bavli in Shabbat that is working off of a similar example to what we have in a Tosefta about if there's a house fire on Shabbos. And that Tosefta also talks about, if I'm not mistaken, I might be misremembering, but I believe that Tosefta also talks about if there is, like literally this example, a barrel breaks on top of someone's roof on Shabbos. So let's take a look, because the question of whether you can be ma'arim or not, the question of whether you can be loopholing or not shows up. So Gufa, let's take a look at this example. Nishbiranu chavit berosh gago. Someone has a barrel, presumably wine or shemen, right, or oil, something expensive, that breaks on their, in their attic or on their roof. Mevi kli umeniach tachta, right? So what you can do is you can bring some sort of vessel to catch whatever drips off the roof into it. But we don't want you bringing vessel after vessel. Now, the Gemara says the reason we don't want you bringing vessel after vessel is because we're worried that you might carry a kli, you might carry a vessel through the public thoroughfare in order to catch as much as you can, because, Adam bahul al mamuno, people are, they really don't want to lose, they kind of lose their heads over their stuff, and they're going to accidentally break Shabbos. The same way we might say in a house fire, you can only save a certain amount, because if we let you save whatever you want, then next thing you know, you're going to actually just put out the house fire. Okay? So nizdamnu lo orchin, but what if you have guests coming, right? Which means maybe you have to collect more even for Shabbos itself. Mevi kli acher v'koleit, kli acher mitzaref. You can bring more kelim, you can bring more vessels to save. But here comes your ha'arama. You should not be bringing another vessel and then inviting guests. What you should do is invite guests first, which, by the way, is a kind of ha'arama in itself, but it's making a change. It's not I'm catching this knowing that I'm going to invite. It's there are people invited. They're coming to my house. They're going to need this drink or condiment to eat or to drink. Right? Ve'ein ma'arimin bekach, and Tanakama says, the first opinion says, you cannot do ha'arama here. Now, what does this mean that you cannot do ha'arama here? Is it you can't invite people for the purpose of saving? It's not really clear what it means that you can't do ha'arama here. Mishum Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda amru ma'arimin. Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda says, yes, you can, which makes it sound like I'm basically just inviting people in order. Now, is it possible that maybe you could read that as a person saying, I'm saving this knowing that I'm going to invite people? It's not really clear. It might just be a clarification of basically the line before. But either way, you have a machloket over whether you can use ha'arama in this case or not. So of course, the Gemara says, oh, we know of another machloket over whether you can use ha'arama. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua, the animal case. Lema beplukta Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua kameflagei. Maybe they're arguing Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda over whether you can use ha'arama or not. Maybe they're arguing over, like they line up with the opinions of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, respectively. In the animal case, remember, Rabbi Eliezer wasn't allowing ha'arama, and Rabbi Yoshua was allowing ha'arama. Titania, because here's the breita. Otova et benoshel naflu labor. If you have a mother and its child animal that falls into a pit, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, no ha'arama, just take the mom out in order to shecht it, take care of the other one, leave it in the pit. But Rabbi Yoshua Omer, no, ma'alet harishon manat l'shofto ve'ino shofto. You can take up the first one in order to shecht it, and then don't shecht it. Uma'arim uma'alet hasheni, and then use ha'arama and bring up the second one. Ratzah zeh shochet, ratzah zeh shochet. You can shecht either one of them. Okay. First thing I want to tell you is before the Gemara goes any further, to try to figure out whether Tanakama follows Rabbi Eliezer, no ha'arama, and Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, and the Breita follows Rabbi Yoshua, yes ha'arama. I want you to notice that the Gemara, the Bavli, changed the case. In our example in the Yerushalmi, in our example in the Tosefta, Rabbi Yoshua says you don't have to shecht either animal at the end. Suddenly it shows up in the Bavli, and you have to shecht one of them. You want to shecht this one, you want to shecht that one. I just want you to notice that. I just want you to notice that. That's another harama process, integrity of process thing. Subtle, but that's how it shows up in the Bavli. Okay, fine, let's continue. Pretend we didn't notice that. Then the Gemara says, wait, Nimai, who says that they line up so neatly, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua? Dilma ad kan lo ka'amar Rabbi Eliezer hatam de'asher parnasa. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer only said you can't use harama in the animal case because you could take care of it in the pit. Aval hacha, but in the case of, your wine streaming off your roof, delo afshar, there's nothing you can do unless you invite more people. You can't save more. Lo, he would say, no, of course I would allow you to do harama, no problem, right? This is your last resort. Even Rabbi Eliezer would allow you to do your last resort. But look at this. Va'ad kan lo kama Rabbi Yoshua hatam. And maybe Rabbi Yoshua only allows in the animal case to do harama mishum de'ika b'tzar ba'alei chayim, because there's pain to the animal. But in the case of your wine streaming off your roof, because there is no tzar ba'alei chayim, but instead, what is there? What's the issue with the wine coming off your roof? Loss of money, Maybe Rabbi Yeshua wouldn't allow. I just want to remind you, in the Yerushalmi, we learned it 2 weeks ago. I'm sure it's clear as day in your minds. In the Yerushalmi, go back to the tape. In the Yerushalmi, Rabbi Yoshua was said to allow harama because he wants to save your money. And it was Rabbi Eliezer who only allows harama if you're trying to avoid a transgression, right? Rabbi Eliezer allowed harama in the dough matzah case because he didn't want you to violate owning chametz. But he wouldn't allow it in the animal case because that's just about saving money. Whereas Rabbi Yoshua says, no, you can do it in the animal case because it's about saving money, and that's a Jewish value. Guess what? The Bavli just turned Rabbi Yoshua into Rabbi Eliezer. The Bavli just said, no, Rabbi Yoshua allows it because we want you not to violate a transgression. Transgression might be rabbinic, it's our ba'alei chayim, but it's a transgression. So look at this. Integrity of goals just got narrowed. Okay? So 2 things happen in this example. One thing that happens is we do not want you to end up not slaughtering either of these animals. We want you to slaughter one of them. And the other thing that happens is Rabbi Yoshua's reasoning is no longer HaTorah chasa al mamonam shel Yisrael. Torah cares about Jewish money, which would have been a more expansive principle than just, I don't want you to violate a halacha, right? I don't want you to violate an isser, rather. Now it's, I don't want you to violate tzar ba'alei chayim, and that's why it's okay. Now, I think these 2 things go together, right? I think there is a concern for this whole performance of your intention. Like, what are you even doing? If you're going to perform this intention, you better shift one of them and justify that was really some intention of yours. And even this whole move of, I might want to shift this one, I might want to shift this one, it's got to be only to keep yourself from violating a halacha, an isser. It's subtle. And can I tell you something? It's not like every shir I give in harama in an hour, this is what we do. But the fact that we have 3 in a row actually allows us to see the difference. In the earlier material, I can perform my intention, not shecht either of them, and it's because it's saving Jewish money. Suddenly, if I'm performing an intention to shecht, I better shecht one of them. And the reason given is because I don't want to violate an isser. That just got narrowed. So I just want to pause there and see if there are any questions. And the question could be, or comments. The question could be very simple, like, could you repeat what you just said? Can you explain what you just said a little bit better? I'm totally fine with that also, Okay. And it can also be like, you know, your great symphony of Chazalic thought. That's also beautiful. Yeah, Caroline, what do you got for us?
Thank you. I have a question regarding the principle of Ho'il. Because if we have, like we said last time, the principle of Ho'il, that a guest might come by, is that, why aren't we automatically
It's for Yom
relying on
Tov.
that?
That's for Yom Tov.
Catching the, okay.
That's for Yom Tov.
Okay, thank you.
The idea that because you might have guests show up, baking and cooking extra would be legitimate. That is a Yom Tov concept. It is not a Shabbos concept. Very good. Other questions? Yeah, Elana. And I hope everybody's okay with the first name basis. I'm happy for everybody to call me. I'm happy to call you. Everybody's good. Yeah.
I'm just noting that with Tsar Balei Haim, I feel like depending on what your values are with respect to, it's like if you need this animal for food, it's one thing, but like I feel like killing animal would be the ultimate Tsar Balei Haim. So it's like it's almost like we don't want the animal in the pit, but we want it either alive or dead. And it's like it's a funny balance all of a sudden.
So you know what's interesting actually? I don't think, and this is not from like deep studying of Tsar Balei Haim, it's from the various places where I've learned it over the years. My impression is that Tsar Balei Haim is not about killing animals. My impression is actually about making them suffer.
Right.
And
but here you need the
animal. I don't even know if it matters. Meaning the point is you're going to now use it in order to get it out of the pit. You're going to shecht it because that's the only way you're going to be allowed to move it out of the pit. And what are we trying to avoid? We're trying to avoid it sitting there in the blazing sun. We're trying to avoid predation, things that might cause, we're trying to avoid actually the animal freaking out because it's not with its mother, right? Like there are a lot of pieces here and it seems like it's suffering less than violence. It's suffering. Is that helpful?
A little bit, but I think it's back to Carolyn's thing, and again, forgive us because we're doing beta, so I think we're totally in the Ho'il world, and there it's like it's very much bottom line, people have to eat. So that's why here it's almost like, oh, the animal is in the pit, but do you actually need to eat? You know, like basically, do you need food or not? Because it's almost like,
right.
I'm just I'm just trying to stack up priorities.
It's not good. So actually, Ho'il is exactly what we're doing next. That is the next source on the sheet. It's not that you need food. It's that you need this animal out of the pit. And in order to get this animal out of the pit, you're essentially saying that you want to shecht it. And the difference between the Yerushalmi and the Bavli is that in the Yerushalmi, you don't have to shecht it in the end. And in the Bavli, you have to shecht at least one of them. Even if you didn't need the food and you didn't want the food, you have to do it. Sorry. Right? Like having the performative intention is not enough. You have to actually do something in the real world to make a change. See what I'm saying?
Okay, then if you don't mind, can I just ask you about the wine case? Because that's Shabbat. And we're not worried about you cooking food, but are you worried backwards way that you have guests coming, you don't have any barrels open, you're going to crack the barrel open to now?
No, so actually what we're worried about is that you're going to bring a lot of different vessels through the public thoroughfare in order to save the wine. So
no, I'm just wondering, can we have the case go the other way, that you didn't expect guests? A lot of guests showed up. You have a barrel. You can't get wine out. Now you're going to crack the barrel so you have more wine. Like, I'm just wondering if it works.
Yeah, it's just, I think, you know.
Like, basically, is this Arama or it's not Arama in this case?
If you think about Chazal and the way they construct cases, usually they're trying to construct a case in order to test an issue, right? So the issue they're trying to test here is whether you can make the choice to invite people in order to create a need for more wine that's coming out of the barrel, right? The question that you're now asking is, what if we had a different case, which is you have a barrel that's not open, what are you able to do on Shabbat, right? So what are the laws of that? And do those laws change? Are they impacted at all by whether there's a need or there isn't a need, right? Now, I might also say, having a barrel on Shabbat, presumably there's some sort of spigot that you can just open, right? Here, the fact is, it's not a good thing when a barrel breaks. It's not something you broke open. It's it broke and it's spilling out everywhere, right? So I want to think it's hard for me to understand the realia because it's not what I truck in, but there are people who really do. And I'm sure there's an article on barrels on Shabbat in the ancient rabbinic world because there's an article on everything. Okay. I want to look at any other questions or comments. I want to look at another example that I think is subtle. The idea that the Bavli is uncomfortable. And when I say uncomfortable, I mean not what's the word I'm looking for? Doesn't want to validate the use of performing your intention. Like, I want to eat this, I want to use this, but you actually have to make it real. Either you invite people, so you make it real, and there it is, right? Or you actually shech the animal. You've just made it real. There it is, right? But they don't like the idea of saying, I'm gonna, and then not doing it. I think that also shows up with the way that the Bavli treats the matzah on Pesach case. Because our matzah on Pesach case, where you have this piece of challah, this portion that's going to have to go in the oven and be burned on Yom Tov because it is tameh, so it can't be eaten by a kohen, and you don't want to put it on your kitchen island because it's going to puff up, it's going to become chametz, and then you're owning chametz. What we saw, the way the Yerushalmi described what Rabbi Eliezer thought you should do, is Rabbi Eliezer said you should put them in the oven, all the pieces of dough, saying, I want to eat this one, I want to eat this one, I want to eat this one. Now, that's performing your intention. That is not making a change. You're not really going to eat it. It's performing your intention. When the Bavli talks about this case, instead of talking about performing intention, it actually asks, well, in theory, could it be eaten? It starts asking a question about plausibility, not about what you intend to do, but a general plausibility question. What that has done is it has removed it from a person saying, this is what I intend to do, to a general principle of, if something could plausibly be eaten on Yom Tov, then it's okay if you bake it, right? They're trying to get away from you, quote unquote, faking your intention. Even if you get to the same result that you're going to be able to put it in the oven, the fact that you get there not by saying, this is what I intend, when clearly you don't, right? But actually you're working off of some, well, is it plausible that it might be eaten, right? All that continues to point to the idea that the rabbis do not want you faking your intention, quote unquote. By the way, for the Yerushalmi, for the Tosefta, I would call it performing intention. I wouldn't call it faking. I don't think they look at it as faking. I think they're saying, how do you define things legally? How do you define intention legally? However I define my intention, that's how it's defined legally. For the Bavli, it's like, what are you talking about? I don't define my intention legally. It's whatever I'm actually intending inside. That's the intention. And we have to decide whether we care about it or we don't care about it. So I want to show you another example. And this is all going to lead to a bigger picture, the same way that last week led to a bigger picture of integrity of process and integrity of goals. This is all going to lead to a bigger picture of what is the role of what I really think and really believe and really want to do in this little wink situation that we're doing called Harama. Because I think that's very important for considering the integrity of the legal system as a whole, right? Because it's a little bit ridiculous to consider that everybody knows what I really think, and yet I'm winking at you, and now it's okay, right? Are we worried about the effects of that on the way people keep halakha? And the answer for the Bavli is a resounding yes, we are very worried about that. So let's take a look. We're continuing to build our case, okay? Here comes the concept that Elana mentioned, or actually, Elana, you were the one who mentioned it, I think, the concept of hoel. We're going to see what it means. Hoel just means since in English, but here's the example. Itmar, it was stated, ha'ofem yom tov l'chol. Let's say somebody bakes on Yom Tov for a non-holiday. That's a violation. That's a violation of not cooking on Yom Tov, right? It's a violation. You can't cook on Yom Tov unless it's for that day. So Rav Chisda Amar Loke. Rav Chisda says, okay, you get malkot. You get lashes, which is what you get for violating Yom Tov. Rabba Amar Eino Loka. Rabba says, no, you don't get lashes. Why not? You literally baked or cooked something on Yom Tov for a non-Yom Tov. So let's see why. Rav Chisda Amar Loka. Rav Chisda says you do get lashes for doing it. Lo amrinan hoel umiklai leorchim chazilai. Because we don't say that given that on Yom Tov, probably you're going to have some visitors come, right? So it is something that you could be eating on Yom Tov. Rav Chisda says, we don't say that. I know on Yom Tov, people go back and forth and they have each other for guests and you don't have the same Eruv problem. So people are probably showing up in places, right? But, and also like Simchat Yom Tov is the meal, right? I'm sorry, just because some guests might show up, you cook this for non-Yom Tov. It doesn't save you that guests might show up. Rabba Amar, Eino Loka. Rabba says, no way. You don't get malkot. You don't get lashes. Amrina and Hoel. We say this principle of because you might have guests come. Again, plausibility. Because you might have guests from, not because you have guests coming, not because you intend to invite guests, not because of anything you feel, but because objectively speaking, guests might show up. By definition, if you baked it, we could consider it as something that's ra'ui, something that is appropriate for eating for that day of Yom Tov. Really interesting. And then, of course, the Gemara, 2 pages later, Rami Bar Chama says, Ha de Rav Chisda the Rabbah, this argument between Rav Chisda and Rabbah about do we consider because it's plausible that you might have people show up, and therefore we say this food is legitimate Yom Tov food or not? Machloket Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua. That reminds me of another machloket, the machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua about matzah on Pesach, about challah dough on Pesach. Obviously, why does Rabbi Eliezer say you can put all the pieces of dough into the oven? So Rabbi Eliezer savar amrin and hoel. Rabbi Eliezer says we use the principle of since, we use a plausibility principle. Rabbi Yeshua savar lo amrin and hoel. Rabbi Yeshua says we don't use a plausibility principle. Now here, the plausibility principle is not who's coming as a guest necessarily. The plausibility principle could even be, is it plausible that I might eat this piece? Sure. But what just happened is we moved it out of the language of what do you want to do, right? What does Cheryl Gordon want to do? And we've moved it into the place of, is it plausible that this item might be eaten on Yom Tov? And if it is something that can be put into the oven. We have moved it away from you, the subject, and we have turned it into a principle. Now, the big question is, why? Why? Why are we doing this, right? Why are we saying you have to shecht at least one of them? Why are we saying you have to think about it as plausibility rather than thinking about it as somebody's subjectivity? Now, one reason is simply the idea that Chazal might have been thinking a lot more about the subjective self. And sure, it was Elana, thank you for that from before, right? Who mentioned Hoel? That was Carolyn. One reason is that they might have been thinking more about the subjective self, but there's another reason also. You can't have legal reality so counterfeit like social reality or perceived reality. Like, you can't tell me that, your intention was to eat this, when everybody in the world who would see the predicament that I'm in knows that I have no interest in eating this. Chazal are very concerned with that. Counterfactual halacha that seems not to really mimic the reality. Why do they care about that? There are so many reasons why they might care about that, right? One reason they might care about that is simply a theory of law, meaning you can have a theory of law. Let's say you have a spectrum between, is law supposed to fundamentally represent reality or reflect reality as it is, or does law create reality, right? Just think on a continuum. It could be that earlier, land of Israel, Tanaim and Amoraim were more on the side of law creates reality. And the Bavli Amoraim and Stamaim right, the anonymous editors, are more on the line of, no, it has to reflect reality. That's one thing it could be. Another thing it could be, it's possible that it takes a heck of a lot of authority to create a situation where everybody knows you're making it up, and all we need you to do is perform your intention. And it could be that it reflects a general conservatism, a growing conservatism in the Bavli, with this sort of authoritative, manipulation of halakha, which shows up in other places, by the way. You see that earlier within Chazal, the idea, can they undermine a biblical law? Earlier, there are threads within Sifrut Chazal, within Chazalic literature, where they suggest that you can. You get to the Bavli and they're like, what are you doing? Right? Like something has totally changed. But I want to say one suggestion that I think is actually very understandable and should actually make us think, which is, one concern is simply, what is this going to do to people's respect for halakha? What kind of slippery slope are we creating when we say you can just do any old thing and everybody can know that you're not telling the truth, and there's no change that you have to make in reality, you just have to make it look like X? No, we need there to be something more concrete, a concrete change, so that it is not so obvious what is going on here. Because guess what? Not everybody is Talmidat Chachamim. Not everybody is Talmid Chachamim. Not everybody is someone who can give you the nuances. Well, you were only allowed to do that because of this, and you knew of this. No, I just saw you, eating this in that place. Now I think you can eat this in that place. Do I know that it was really this and it wasn't that? What are we talking about here? Like, that's not the way that we do business, right? The way that we do business is we want the average person to actually be able to understand what's going on and not get a misimpression. So I want to talk about that. That's where I want to end tonight, is the example where Chazal make it very clear. Oh, yeah. We're very worried about integrity of process, and integrity of process has everything to do with how obvious is this? Integrity of process has everything to do with, is this going to cause people to not keep halakha properly in the future, right? Carolyn, what do you got?
Oh, I think you kind of touched on it, because I was going to ask, is it possible that the difference between the way Yerushalmi presents loopholes versus the Bavli has to do with the kind of like the sociological things happening at the time, that the rabbis needed to create a more systemic halakha, kind of like the Shulchan Aruch, that we're like, this is now it?
I think it is very hard to know. I know that there are people who specialize in the historicization of things. I am much more interested in what I might call judicial phenomenology, meaning phenomenon X shows up in these sources, phenomenon Y shows up in those sources. Do I know why? No. Can I surmise? Sure, right? Like I could surmise, well, the general legal culture is less about manipulation and is more interested in how things reflect the reality. It could be, yes, they saw that people were actually misunderstanding what was going on. It could be that they started becoming a bigger movement. And as a bigger movement, they needed to think beyond what rabbis themselves were going to be able to know and do, right? Like, I don't know. I leave that to my historian colleagues. What I do is I point out don't get me wrong, in my book, I make suggestions because you're kind of supposed to, but I don't know, I don't know, right? Like it could also be internal. Like here we are developing something, and even if nothing changes on the ground, we actually start thinking because a new generation is working with the ideas, and that new generation is saying, let's just develop this further. I actually think this doesn't really work with that, and what about that, right? Like suddenly we don't see things like, there's a Gemara in Kiddushin that talks about if a person sells all of their stuff to move to Israel, right? And then they don't move, or it doesn't work out, they come back, okay? So the Gemara talks about this concept of Devarim Shebalev, right? When I am making what's the word I'm looking for? A transaction with somebody, does my sense of why I'm doing it, is that part of the contract or not? That is a very subjective discussion, right? Like that's a discussion of a very subjective reality. Does that show you something about the way that Chazal are thinking about internal self? Or, this is what Dr. Ayelet Lipson's book suggests. Like, she suggests when you look at the Tanaim and then you look at the Amoraim, and I'm not sure, I don't remember if she does Yerushalmi to Bavli. I think she does, but it seems like the Amoraim and the Bavli are just more aware of people's internal perspectives on themselves. I don't know why. I really don't want, I don't know why. I think it's called the subjective self. I believe that's what it's called. I'm going to write it here. Okay, other questions? Okay, I want to show you one more. Okay, and you can always write to me. You can always email me if you're thinking it through. Okay, and I want to remind you that next week we're going to be going super duper practical. But I think what we're going to see in Mechirat Chametz, we're going to see some of this, some of the trail of this. Okay, so here's our third example for tonight. And this is not subtle at all, which is what I love about it. It tells you what it's thinking. So the Bavli in Shabbat, Daf Kuf Lamed Tet Bet, 139b, Amar Rabba Bar Rav Huna says, Ma'arim Adam ala mishmeret b'yom tov, litlot ba rimonim v'tole ba shmarim. A person can do ha'arama, right? This is one of those few examples that are not from Tanaitic literature, and the Bavli is quoting it. It's a new one in the Bavli, quote unquote. A person may perform subterfuge, I guess, in order to create a strainer, right? To basically take a cloth and pull it over two things that are going to hold it in place, right? To create a strainer on Yantif, okay? Now, why would it be a problem to create a strainer on Yantif? Okay, so some people think it's uvda d'chol. It's a non-Yantif kind of thing to do, to create a strainer, right? Now, you can strain wine on Yantif. Again, this is part of your preparation of your wine, right? You have to remember what their situation was. But you shouldn't be creating the strainer on Yantif, okay? And it says here, you can do ha'arama to create a strainer for what? Litlot ba rimonim, to put pomegranates in. Oh, no. I'm not making a strainer. I'm making a fruit basket. And then once I've made the fruit basket, right, by putting a little cloth with two things that hold it up at the end, v'toleh b'shmarim, then I can put my wine and filter my wine through it. I didn't make a strainer on Yantif. I made a fruit basket, meaning I just made something that's going to hold my rimonim, right? And now once I've done it, I can use that. Beautiful, classic performative intention, right? Classic. Rav Ashi says, not so fast. V'hu d'tala b'rimonim. You have to actually put pomegranates in it first. None of this performative intention stuff. I want you making a concrete change. You tell me that you're making something in order to hold pomegranates, put some pomegranates in it, okay? Then it's a fruit basket. This is totally explicit. And now the Gemara says, wait, why? My shna, what is the difference between this example? Meha Tanya from the following breakdown. You are allowed to brew beer on Chol Hamoed for the purpose of the holiday. But Shalol Tzarech HaMoed Asur, you shouldn't be, right? Because we're not supposed to be doing labor that is not needed for the holiday. Echad Shechar Tzmerim, Echad Shechar Sorim. I don't care if it's made from dates. I don't care if it's made from barley. But you know what you can do? Even if you have old beer, meaning you have beer already, you can make new beer, making it seem like you need it, right? Even though that beer is going to be for after the holiday. And all you have to do is drink something from it sometime during the moed, sometime during the holiday. Now, I want you to look at these side by side. I want you to think about these as two screens. One screen, I want to make this strainer for Yantif. You know what I have to do first? I have to put a fruit in it to make it look like a fruit basket. I want to make new beer on Yantif, on Chol Hamoed. That's for after the holiday. Oh, no problem. You can do that. Just perform the intention that you need it. And then afterwards, take a little drink, right? So do something concrete afterwards, but you don't have to do anything before. What do you mean? Why not? I thought the point is you can't just say an intention. I thought you had to like actually. Now, you might say, by the way, that, well, maybe when you take a drink from it afterwards, you are proving something. But it's interesting that it seems like the Gemara is not even okay with that. Right? It's saying, no, why aren't you doing something before? And look at the Gemara's answer. And I think the Gemara's answer is really important. Hatam lo mochach hamilta. In the case of brewing new beer, it's not obvious to everybody what you're doing. They don't know if you have enough beer for the holiday. They might think you just like a different IPA. So you're doing this beer, who cares, right? But hacha mochach hamilta. But in the case of a strainer, it's obvious to everybody what you're doing. What is this? This concern of whether it's obvious or it's not obvious, that's a really important concept in the Bavli. If it is obvious that there's a gap between what you're saying you're doing and what you're actually doing, they're not happy about it. And there are a lot of reasons why they might not be happy about it, as we mentioned a few minutes ago. But I want you to notice what comes next, because what comes next gives you a little bit of an insight as to at least why they're not happy about it here. Amru le Rabbanan le Ravashi. Rabbanan say to Ravashi, Chazi mar hai tzur b'nei Rabbanan. I want you to notice that there is a young student going around. V'Rav Huna bar Rabbi Chion Shmei. His name is Rav Huna bar Rabbi Chion. V'Amile Rav Huna bar Chelvon Shmei, or his name might be Rav Huna bar Rabbi Chelvon. And look what he does. The shakil bara detuma umanach bebar zedana. What he does is he takes garlic and he puts it in the spout of a barrel. V'amar la'atznuei kamakavna. And he says, I'm just putting this garlic here because I need somewhere to put it. And really what he's doing is he's fixing the barrel, right? Which he's not allowed to do. And yet he does that on Shabbos. Isn't that obvious? Isn't that a problem that he's doing that? Isn't that obvious? He's saying, oh, my intention is this. So what? I thought it's not performing intention. That doesn't work. And by the way, you know what else he does? He also lies down on a ferry belonging to a non-Jew. And on Shabbos, he's asleep on this ferry that goes across the water, and he goes and looks at his produce to see how they're doing on Shabbos. He shouldn't be going across the water on Shabbos. He says, no, I was just sleeping. I was just sleeping. I thought you said you can't do this obvious ruse. You can't do these obvious ruses by just pretending what your intention is. So look at what he answers. Amar Lahu, he says, Ha'arama kamrit. You're talking about this guy doing a ha'arama, this guy doing some subterfuge. Ha'arama bidirabanan he. Oh gosh. No clue how to read this line. It could be ha'arama. This ha'arama is only on a rabbinic violation, right? Because, stopping up a barrel with a garlic is not exactly fixing it, properly. And certainly going across the river on Shabbos is only derabanan, right? That's one way to read it. Another way to read it is the rabbis are the ones who give you the concept of ha'arama to begin with. But look at the end of the line is v'tzur b'mei rabbanan, and a young scholar lo ati lemeba l'chadchila. A young scholar is not going to go do these things without a ha'arama. Meaning, what are we really worried about? If it's too obvious, people are just going to say, what do you mean? If your animals fall in a pit on Yantif, just take them out. I don't need this whole business of, I'm going to shecht it, I'm not going to shecht it. Oh, by the way, and also animals aren't muktzah on Shabbos. It's fine. On Yantif, it's fine. Right? The worry is the kind of slippery slope of where we go. Right? And there's much more to this, right? And I'm always going to say to people, just read the book. It'll help you get, like I'm just saying, it'll help you get through it. But what I think is so interesting here is they really are worried that like maybe we should only allow certain people to use ha'arama, like because it won't confuse them. Or maybe only certain people can use obvious haramas, or maybe nobody should use obvious haramas. But there's a whole slew of concerns here of it's too obvious. Is somebody going to end up not using the harama and just go and violate the law outright? These are new concerns, right? If there was hints to them, maybe in the Yerushalmi, and there is a place where I saw maybe a hint to it in the Yerushalmi, not in what we learned, but in another case. Here, it's just outright. We are worried about what this is going to do to the ma'arechet, to the framework of halacha. We want to make sure that the framework of halacha does not get undermined in a deep way. Pause here, questions, comments, and then I'm going to close up by 30 after, half past. This was not easy stuff. Feel free to email me. Next week, we are doing pretty easy stuff. Mechirat chametz, sale of chametz. But what we're going to see is we're going to see how actually that conversation halachically has a lot to do with what we looked at last week and this week. Okay?
I'm not going to lie. I'm very disappointed. I was hoping it was going to come out not that the rabbis were worried that people would be stupid, but that the rabbis would be concerned for people's integrity and you know, that they shouldn't just be faking things out. They should be taking the law seriously. So I'm very sad that it came out this way.
Miriam, I'm glad you said that, because I don't think that they thought it wasn't taking the law seriously to use harama. I think lahefech, they thought it was, meaning tip your cap. And I think the worry was not everybody is going to know to do that. And I think that's just true in life. But let's keep thinking about it and talking about it, because I think it's going to come up again, this question, in the move from people selling their own chametz privately to having a rabbinic emissary sell their chametz for them, right? I think we're going to get back into that. But if you want to write me more about that, just send me an email. I'm happy to continue the conversation, because I also want to learn from how people experience this, this Torah and these ideas. Okay, I'm just putting my email in there, and I'm going to say have a great day to everybody, and see you next week. Be'ezrat Hashem. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much,
you.
Elana. And
Pleasure.
I put in the chat a link to Elana's books with a book with a 30% off coupon code for
Yes.
our students. And yeah, we will see each other next week. I also wanted to mention that Sephir Azman classes starting after Passover are now open for registration. You can sign up at drisha.org/classes. And again, thank you again, Elana, and thank you everyone for participating and being a part of our learning community here at Drisha. Lehitraot, and see you next week.